All right.
Good afternoon. Just a few words of introduction to today's guest speaker. As noted by the slide, Yessy lives in Edmonton, Alberta. I had the opportunity of meeting her, well, maybe 6 or 8 months ago when I followed up on an inquiry about glass buttons. And we built a conversation back and forth since then, and I invited her to speak with us today. Yessy is a retired human rights, labor lawyer, educator, and she states right up front that she inherited her collector genes from her father, but found that her true calling when she discovered buttons in 1995. She then discovered the National Button Society and has been a member since 1997. Yessy has served on the board of the society in 2004 and 2006 and was an executive officer from 2014 to 2020 and became the first Canadian president of the society in 2018. She continues to be very active in this organization with education projects, presentations, articles, and currently serves as chair of the Society's classification committee. Yessy is particularly fascinated with the social history of buttons, from the cottage industry of fabric buttons in the 1500s to the production of glass buttons in the 1800s. And so today we welcome Yessy and her presentation on glass buttons.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for being so accommodating on the start time. I appreciate that. I love glass buttons. They're beautiful. I think I may have started really focusing on them because they used to be quite reasonably priced and they're so beautiful. So anyway, I got solidly hooked very early on, and in the meantime, I was lucky enough to go and do some tours of the Czech Republic. So you'll see some pictures of that. So I want to do just a little bit of history, some backdating of black glass buttons, then talk about and show you slides on button production in Czech Republic, and then talk about Alta glass. Now we're making a huge leap, but we're still talking glass buttons. So, and in the end, I'd like to show you a few of my favorite glass buttons. The first, the earliest black glass buttons that we have documented came from Bavaria, and it's really an interesting history. They had, I think there's a special kind of sand in the mountains in this area in Bavaria, and they had quite a thriving black glass industry in that area. And what I found so fascinating is that they found these buttons throughout the United States. So you've got black glass buttons from the 1600s being found in Jamestown, in Maryland. And the most interesting one was the find on a Native American site where white settlers had not reached. So obviously these black glass buttons were being used as trade items. So that's, the references are on the bottom here. These pictures are from the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory, but the information, which I found really fascinating, is from an article where you may be familiar with Carlos Carclins. He's a Canadian, he's not an archaeologist, anthropologist. Anyway, they have done an interesting paper on the bead and button industry of Bavaria in the 1600s. And that's available on the internet. Now, things apparently shifted, and the center of, I don't know what happened in the 1700s, except I know there was some glass production in the late 1700s in Bohemia, which of course now is Czech Republic. But the glass that was being made around the turn of that century was glass that was set into metal. And these are the earliest freestanding, if you will, black glass buttons that have been documented from the Jablonsk Glass Museum. And they're dated between 1800 1825. Now, if you ever decide to go to Eastern Europe, I highly recommend a visit to the Jablonsk Glass Museum. It is beautiful museum. It's fascinating. They don't have a group, well, they've just opened an exhibition on buttons that I haven't seen yet, so I have to go back again. But they have an amazing array of glass items. Anyway, glass button production in the 1800s, a lot of it was done by families. So it's cottage industry. There were some factories, but of course I found the cottage industry to be most interesting. And this was the last functioning button hut. And that's what they were called. You can see them around the countryside around Jablonsk, and they're distinguished by, see the roof line? That's the furnace outlet and the chimney. You see them all over the place. This one I visited 10 years ago. I don't believe it's functioning anymore. And at that time, it was the last button hut. So the buttons are made with these molds that inside they're like pliers, I suppose, or pinchers. And the mold for the glass is at that rounded end. And these molds are ones that were used in the 1800s, and they're still being used. And it's interesting because I've got a lot of modern Czech glass that is the same design as the old, but you can see that the molds have worn down over the years. So the patterns aren't as defined as they used to be. But they use the same molds and the same techniques. And this is a preliminary shot of the technique used to make these glass buttons. Okay, so you start with the glass rods, and they're still being made in the Czech Republic. And it was interesting, one of the references in Alta Glass I found was they were importing glass rods from Czech Republic in the 50s. So you start with the glass rods, and these rods are heated in the furnace. There's always, this person always had 2 rods in there. And you'll see on the right-hand side, you see he's holding, well, I'll call them scissors. And behind that is the button mold. So, and then of course, buttons have shanks. So unfortunately, I have this picture cuts out, your pictures cut out the pile of shanks that are sitting on the right. But you can see here, those shanks are moved over, and then a shank is placed on the bottom of that button mold. So then he takes out one of the glass heated rods. Apparently at the end, the glass is cool enough to pick up. It looks, of course, this is clear glass, so you really get that picture of the flame coming through. And you can see him with the glass, with the mold about to pinch that hot glass rod. And you see the shanks here now. And here's a shot of it in action. I love that picture. You see the glass rod here, and the end of it is in that mold that's being pinched together. Another view of that. And then he takes his scissors and snips it off. It's still hot enough, you can snip that glass off. And it goes in the cooling drawer. Then the finishing part is amazingly labor intensive. This woman, and I think they were related, this couple, the older gentleman who was doing the pressing, and this woman, but she scores the edges. Each piece gets individually scored, and some of it breaks off there, and otherwise you knock it off. It's incredibly labor intensive. And I must say, I did worry about all those bits of glass flying around. But then each individual button is placed on this finisher, which rotates and cleans off the edges. So you now will get the finished clear glass button. It's a very labor intensive process. It's just which is probably why there are no longer any button huts. And then the buttons are shipped off to the finishing place where people hand paint them. These buttons that you see, the Czech glass buttons, are all hand painted. And I must say, I was back in the Czech Republic last year, and there's the big factory that I had seen before is closed down. There's one very small factory that produces it. It's basically run by a family and a few employees, but there's still the button production is a little more mechanized, but all that finishing is all done by hand. And here you see some finished products. It's just amazing. Those are clear glass, so some of them are painted on the back, so you have that pattern showing through the clear glass, and you'll see this row here is back painted. Most of these are back painted. Amazing amount of work goes into that. And it really is kind of sad, because there was one larger scale factory called Preciosa that produced buttons and beads, and they're now out of business. So you don't see, and these pictures are from 10 years ago, you just don't see very many glass buttons being produced in Czech Republic anymore. So if you have some, hold on to them. They're going to be even more collectible down the road. So that's my little talk on the Czech glass. Does anybody have any questions about this part? And then I'll go on to talk about Alta glass. No? Okay. I'll take questions at the end as well. Okay. And now we're going to jump from Europe into Canada. And that's a fascinating history, actually. And there's a few books out about Alta glass and a number of articles. And I want to point out, it's become my personal thing, that John Birch did not start Alta glass. The Yule family, or Medicine Hat potteries, started Alta glass and Medicine Hat. And in fact, I'm just going to read this to you. I've got this lovely telegram. They did a lot of business via telegram in the 1950s. And I've got a copy of the telegram from the Glass Guild in Stratford, Ontario, saying, okay, we've got a deal. We've got, we will sell you the business of the glass production for $7,500 cash for equipment. And it also says, my understanding, we will terminate Stratford operations by March 31st, and the Furch family will remain on my payroll until that date. You will assume the salary of Furch and Son from April 1st and will arrange details of his contract, including moving expense to Alberta. And in fact, that deal did go ahead and go to completion. So Birch was hired. They were Stratford Glass, the Glass Guild wanted to concentrate on the production of glass towel bars. Apparently that was a hot item in the 50s, and they wanted to get rid of the glass button production. A friend of mine had this card. If anybody comes across a card of the Glass Guild glass buttons, let me know. They're hard to find. So that's the start of Alta Glass. The Yule family in Medicine Hat purchased the assets, and they hired John Furch to run the business in Medicine Hat. And going through, I spent just a wonderful day at the Medicine Hat archives, going through all the correspondence about the purchase and the startup of Alta Glass. Like there's a few wonderful letters about the name, how they came up, how Yule came up with the name Alta Glass. He had hired a sort of a publicist, I guess, a friend of his in Seattle, and they worked out the design of the cards, the name of the company, and marketing options. It's really interesting information. So it's if you ever get to Medicine Hat, it's worth sitting down and going through those archives. But some of the correspondence is really interesting, like that Czech glass buttons were actually cheaper than the Alta glass buttons. You know, clear glass buttons were much more in fashion than colored. And then you can see on the slide what the prices were for glass buttons. And it wasn't very much, was it? Mind you, I guess it was 1951. $1.80 was probably a lot more than it is now. You might be able to find one button for $1.80 instead of 18 cards of them. Anyway, it was really interesting. They sold a lot of buttons to Hudson Bay and Eaton's at that time. They were only produced for 2 years at Alta Glass, which is kind of interesting. There's no documentation about why it ended, although the ending of the button production seems to coincide with John Furch taking over the company. So clearly Furch no longer had an interest in continuing to produce buttons. And there was nothing at the archives documenting that handover from the Yule family or Medicine Hat Potteries to Furch. So I don't know what happened there. But this is my working card of Alta Glass buttons. It shows you the range of colors and the different designs that they produced. And they are distinctive buttons. I have not seen this kind of rounded shank in any other glass buttons, and their edges are also unique. They're they look rough. They don't feel rough, but they look rough, and apparently that's because of their shearing process that Stratford had developed that made the production so much easier, just shearing off the glass. Remember what, in the check slides, that woman scored the edges and knocked off the edges. Well, they simplified that a great deal and had a machine that just sheared off the edges, but it did leave a rougher looking edge. And this was fun. I went to a button convention in the States, and somebody had this card, which was really interesting. I don't know how it made its way to the States, and the dealer was from like Texas. So anyway, there you go. But it does give you some other ideas as to colors and patterns. But from the outset, John Furch had worked in England. He had originally been, I think, a welder, a tradesman at a glass factory in Czech Republic. He escaped from Czech Republic because of the Nazi invasion of that area, and he had been a supporter of the Democratic Party, so he had to leave and went to England and worked for a couple of glass companies, including Nazing Glass, as a welder, but apparently learned about glass making. Their Nazing Glass had some real issues in 1949. They had, I think it was a flood, and basically their factory shut down. And at that point, Stratford, or the Glass Guild, brought Furch and his family to Stratford, Ontario. So just a little history on John Furch. But apparently he had done some lampwork glass work, and he started this kind of work at Alta Glass early on. And after he took over the company, that's what they concentrated on. So you see a lot of swans and other items. So that's a brief history of the button production and Alta Glass. Like I said, I was quite taken aback when I went through the archives, because it was so clear that Furch had not started Alta Glass. And I think that's unfortunate that our history has gotten so warped. And I think the Yule family really does deserve the credit for bringing that glass industry to Alberta and maintaining. I mean, the Glass Guild in Stratford would have shut down this, and they were going to send the Furch family back to England. They were going to pay for his. So we maintained a glass industry because the Yule family was prepared to buy the business and provide the Furch family with employment. So that's my plug for the Yule family and Medicine Hat Potteries. So I did want to show you some glass buttons, just to show you the kind of, you've seen some very small segments of our glass button varieties. So just to show you what's out there. These are two of my oldest clear and color. We have two in the button collecting world. We have two areas, clear and color glass and black glass. We sort of separate them out. I don't know why we did that originally, but I must say I have more black glass than anything else. On the left, you see an 18th century opalescent glass with the paste. It's a pin shank. So the shank is attached to the paste. And these were probably made in France. We haven't been able to track it down, but as far as I can tell from other documentation and other museum collections, this is likely made in France. And on the right is my most impressive glass button. It's actually glass paste set in silver. And that's about 1800, it could be 17, very early 1800s. It's a stunning button. So this is my oldest black glass button. I was able to document this through the museum in Yablonsk. It's from about 1830. And you see it's a pin shank. That means that knob on the top is attached to the shank. And I'll talk about that back in a minute. In the mid 1800s, what was really popular in Bohemia were the trend was very small buttons. And if you see pictures of the earlier mid 1800s dresses, buttons tended to be more decorative rather than fasteners. So you would have rows of buttons down the front of your dress. But it wasn't until a little later in the 1800s that you saw metal buttons that were fastening. But these buttons are very small. They're under an inch. They're usually about a ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch. And they are mid 1800s, and they're swirl backs. So what you have on the right, I've got a picture, blown up picture of a swirl back paperweight button that was made about 1850. And you see on the back the swirls around the shank, so that the glass was swirled around. And then I think what happened was it was then inserted into a mold to produce that shape and the surface design. But you'll see all of these have swirls on the back. In other words, they were all lampwork glass. And they're amazing. The middle one is one of my all-time favorites. It's a realistic dog head. Again, mid 1800s. There's some talk, there's some speculation that the Bohemia glass producers actually invented paperweights. That's where this, the bigger paperweights came from, the idea of those paperweight glass buttons. Just speculation. That was one person who had done some research on these, but they're amazing. Like this salted paperweight is truly amazing. It's a salt overlay on top of the glass. Beautiful, beautiful buttons. A lot of work, a lot of handwork. You see the metal bound, the double overlays on the glass. Really interesting buttons. I have a big collection of swirl back buttons. And just to show you some other techniques, these are all 1800s buttons. You've got a ribbon overlay on the far left. Etch glass. These are all, again, these two are small. They're less than 3/4 of an inch. Silver resist. That's a unique technique. It's an overlay of silver, and you always can tell it on the back of a button because the silver is traced all the way to the shank. Quite an interesting button. The watch crystal is fascinating. It's a glass. This is a modern term for that button, but there's a sheet of glass. They start with that. Then they paint the design, so the bird and the border are painted. And then there's chips of shell put on the back. That's what you see as a background. Those are actual shell chips. And then there's, now I'm going to forget the word. There's like a paste. Sorry, I'm going to have one of those forgetful moments. There's a sort of paste put on the back to hold it all together. Amazing construction. And then on the right, you have a latticino. It's a paperweight as well on a black glass base. And you can see flecks of goldstone in there too. But it's a remarkable paperweight. Again, mid-1800s. The silver resist is a little later, probably later 1800s. Watch crystal, I'd say around 1860 or so. Ribbon overlay a little later. But now we get into modern, I call modern buttons. You'd think 100 years ago isn't really modern, but it's button wording. But what you see after World War I, of course, you've got the whole Art Deco movement, but buttons got large. And the pictures and the decoration becomes more important than the actual glass making techniques. It also has, you've also got more mechanization, so more factory production rather than cottage industry production. So quite a shift in what kinds of buttons you see. These are buttons at the museum. Last year when I went, I was really lucky. One of the curators took me through their archives, so I had a lot of fun looking at what they had hidden away. And here's just some examples of different kinds of 20s and 30s glass buttons. The two on the left are mine. The red glass is actually red glass inserted into or glued onto a black glass base. And the three on the right are from the museum in Yablonec. Those are all from sample cards, which was fascinating because the sample cards always had dates on them. So it was really interesting. So that's it. Some resources if you're interested in looking more at glass buttons. The National Button Society does have some links to resources. And we maintain a website called Button Country that has a lot of pictures and information about buttons. So that's it. So thank you.
Yessy,
So,
that was amazing.
oh,
Amazing.
thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. We're glued to our screen. That was amazing. Thank you so very much.
Well, I just barely went over that half hour.